I had always considered myself a peaceful person. I wasn't the type to get involved in neighborhood drama or stir up trouble with anyone. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing you into situations you never expected. It all started when I bought my first home. The house was perfect for me, a cozy, quiet retreat away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Nestled in a beautiful neighborhood, I felt like I had found my little slice of peace. The property was spacious enough for me to enjoy my privacy, and the house itself was charming, just the right mix of old-world character and modern conveniences. But what I didn't expect was the HOA, or more specifically, one of the members of that HOA, Karen. At first, Karen seemed like just another neighbor, but that would change soon enough. Karen lived 2 doors down and was always friendly, waving when we saw each other, and chatting about the neighborhood from time to time. I thought nothing of it at first. That was until I noticed something strange about my property. Behind my house was a narrow strip of land that led into the neighborhood. It wasn't a road, but it had a path that looked clear enough to be used as one. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a leftover path from the previous owner, or perhaps it had been used for something else a long time ago. However, I started seeing something more unsettling. Cars began driving through this strip of land like it was a public road. It wasn't just one car here and there either. Over time, it became a regular occurrence. Every few days, I'd notice the same cars driving through my yard. It wasn't even a situation where they were driving by quickly, no, they were stopping, making turns, and cutting across my grass as if it was the easiest way into the neighborhood. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought, maybe they're lost, or it'll stop soon enough. But when the same thing kept happening, it started to get under my skin. What bothered me the most wasn't just the fact that people were trespassing on my land, it was the way they acted about it. Every time I tried to let them know that this wasn't a public road, they'd either ignore me or give me a weird look, like I was the one in the wrong. I started waving at the drivers, trying to be polite, letting them know they shouldn't be driving through. But no one seemed to care. They acted like it was no big deal. It was as if they felt entitled to drive across my land whenever they wanted. And what really made me angry was when I came home from work one morning to see a car make a sharp turn onto the strip of land. I was only a few steps away, and I saw the tires spin out and tear up a large chunk of my yard. That was the last straw. I couldn't just stand by and let people destroy my property like that. I was upset, frustrated, and honestly, I felt helpless. But I knew something had to be done. I immediately called the HOA and explained the situation. I told them that people were using my private property as a shortcut, that cars were damaging my lawn, and I needed their help to stop it. I figured this was exactly what the HOA was there for, to manage the community and make sure things like this didn't happen. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I called them, I was surprised by their response. The HOA told me that since the strip of land wasn't technically part of their jurisdiction, they couldn't do anything about it. They said it wasn't their responsibility to deal with the issue, and I was on my own. I was stunned. How could they just wash their hands of the situation? I couldn't believe that the very people who were supposed to help protect my property weren't even willing to take action. That's when I realized I had to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't wait around for someone else to fix this. If I didn't stand up for myself now, things would only get worse. I decided to take action. I wasn't about to let my property be treated like a public road. If the HOA wouldn't help, then I would have to solve this myself. After thinking about it for a while, I realized that putting up a fence was the best solution. A solid, sturdy fence would keep anyone from driving through my yard. I wasn't just talking about a small picket fence either, this was going to be a real barrier. I needed something that would be visible and unmovable, something that would make it clear to anyone who even thought about crossing my land that it wasn't going to happen. So, I called up a contractor to get started on the job. The process of putting up the fence was a bit more complicated than I expected, but I didn't mind. It gave me a sense of control, something I hadn't felt in a while, given how things had been going with the trespassing. The contractor came over, took measurements, and made sure everything was in line with property regulations. It wasn't just about blocking the road, it was about protecting what was mine. I also made sure to put up clear, "No trespassing" signs, just in case anyone tried to claim they didn't know they were violating my property. I wanted to make it as clear as possible that this was my land, and nobody had permission to use it. A few days after the fence was up, I felt a sense of relief. Finally, I could breathe easy knowing that people wouldn't be driving through my yard anymore. I even started to enjoy the quiet again, without worrying about cars tearing up my lawn. But as with all things involving entitled people, I should have known the peace wouldn't last long. Less than a week after the fence was completed, I came home one Saturday afternoon to find a car parked right in front of the gate. The driver was honking repeatedly, and the scene was starting to get on my nerves. I walked up to the car, wondering what was going on. As I got closer, the woman in the car rolled down her window and immediately started yelling at me. "Are you the one who put up this fence?" she demanded, her face contorted with anger. "You need to open it. I'm already late." Her tone was rude and dismissive, like I had no right to stop her from driving through my property. At first, I was taken aback. I didn't know who this woman was, but she clearly wasn't happy with the changes I had made. Before I could say anything, she got out of the car and stormed over to me, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. She was tall, wearing a bright red jacket, and her expression was one of pure entitlement. I stood there, trying to keep calm. I wasn't one to engage in confrontation, but the more I looked at her, the angrier I got. She was clearly part of the HOA, judging by the way she carried herself. I had heard stories about HOA members thinking they could control everything, even private property that didn't belong to them. It seemed like Karen, as I'd later come to call her, might be one of those people. She was probably used to getting her way, especially since she was on the HOA board. She didn't waste any time. "Open the gate now. You can't block this road. We've been using this access point for years," she barked. I had to stop myself from rolling my eyes. It wasn't a road, and it wasn't public access. This was my property, and she had no right to tell me what to do with it. But she didn't seem to care. "I'm on the HOA board, and you're going to regret this. The HOA will hear about this," she threatened, her face red with anger. I wasn't intimidated. I had already done my research. The land wasn't part of the HOA, and they had no jurisdiction over it. I had every right to restrict access to my property. I wasn't going to back down just because some woman on the board thought she could bully me into submission. I calmly told her, "This is my property. I don't want anyone driving through it anymore. You're trespassing." Karen didn't take kindly to that. Her voice rose, and she pointed a finger at me, practically shaking with rage. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," she said. "You can't just block a road like this. The HOA will come after you, and you'll regret it." She pulled out her phone and started dialing, likely preparing to call someone in the HOA to escalate things. But I wasn't worried. I knew my rights, and I knew she was in the wrong. Just as Karen was about to make her call, I knew things were about to escalate. I stood firm, refusing to let her bully me. I wasn't about to be intimidated by her or anyone else. But the situation didn't end there. Karen, clearly thinking she could get her way with a simple phone call, dialed the HOA and began telling them that I was blocking a public road. It was ridiculous. The land was private property, and Karen had no legal right to demand that I open the gate. But she wasn't done yet. I could hear her voice getting louder as she argued on the phone. "This man is blocking access to our neighborhood. You need to do something about it," she was yelling. I wasn't sure what she thought would happen next. She probably expected the HOA to side with her, but I wasn't backing down. I had done my research. The HOA had no authority over private property that wasn't within their community, and they certainly couldn't tell me how to manage my land. I wasn't worried about her phone call, but I could see that Karen was becoming more and more desperate. I could feel the tension rising as she waved her phone in my face, probably hoping to make me feel intimidated. But I just stood there, calm and collected, letting her rant. And then, just as I thought the situation couldn't get any more absurd, Karen decided to call the police. Yes, you read that right. She actually called 911, claiming that I was blocking a road. She was determined to make her point, even if it meant dragging law enforcement into the mix. I couldn't believe it. Calling the police over something like this? It felt like a scene from a bad movie. But of course, the police arrived shortly after, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of amusement and frustration. When the officer got out of his car, I could see that he was confused. He looked at the gate, then at Karen, then back at me. "We got a call about someone blocking a road," he said, looking back at the gate I had installed. "Is this a public road?" "No," I replied, shaking my head. "This is my property. I put up the gate to stop people from using it as a shortcut. Karen here is trespassing." I pointed to Karen, who was still standing there, her arms crossed and her expression one of disbelief. The officer took a look at the property map I had with me and nodded. "Okay, I see," he said, looking at Karen. "This isn't a public road, and you have every right to block access to it. I'm going to speak with my partner." The officer walked away to confer with the other officer, and I could hear Karen's angry protests in the background. But I wasn't worried. I knew I was in the right. After a few moments, the officer came back and calmly told Karen, "She's been misinformed. This isn't a public road, and you don't have any right to use it. The property owner is within their rights to block access." I could hear Karen still arguing with the other officer as he walked away, but it was clear that her attempt to get the police involved had backfired. She had been expecting them to side with her, but instead, they confirmed that I was legally in the right. I was beginning to feel like I was winning this battle. Karen, on the other hand, was losing ground fast. Her face turned redder as she tried to argue with the officers, but it was clear they weren't having it. The situation seemed to defuse, but not before Karen stormed back over to me. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice full of venom. "You'll regret blocking that road. I'm going to make sure the HOA takes action, and you'll pay for this." I wasn't intimidated. I had already stood my ground, and I wasn't going to let her threats scare me. "Go ahead," I said calmly. "But just know, this is my property. If anyone tries to use it again, I'll call the police myself." The officers nodded in agreement, and Karen, clearly frustrated and defeated, turned and walked away. As I watched her leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had underestimated me, and now it was clear she wouldn't be able to take advantage of my property anymore. The HOA's involvement was getting more ridiculous by the day, and it seemed like they were backing down. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. As much as I wanted to relax and move on with my life, I had a feeling things were about to get even more complicated. A few days passed, and things were eerily quiet. I didn't see any more cars driving through my yard, and Karen had stayed out of sight. It felt like the situation had finally blown over, and I could breathe a little easier. But this is an HOA story, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that things rarely stay quiet for long. I had been preparing for the next shoe to drop, and I wasn't disappointed. Just about a week after my confrontation with Karen, I received a letter from the HOA. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe they were finally going to back off and leave me alone. But as I read through the letter, my blood started to boil. The HOA was officially getting involved. They wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the issue of my fence and the public access point I had blocked off. The letter claimed that the strip of land was a long-standing shortcut, and that by blocking it, I was interfering with the community's needs. They even hinted that I might be in violation of some community easement. The audacity! This was my property, not a public road. I had every right to block it off. It was beyond frustrating, but I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. I read the letter a few more times to make sure I wasn't missing anything. It was clear that the HOA was trying to pressure me into removing the gate and allowing access through my land. But I wasn't about to give in. I had done my research, and I knew the law. The strip of land wasn't part of their jurisdiction, and there was no legal requirement for me to allow anyone to use it. The HOA had no right to tell me what to do with my property, no matter how long it had been used as a shortcut. I started gathering all the evidence I would need for the upcoming meeting. I pulled out the property map, made sure I had all the photos of the land, and even went over the footage from my security cameras. I wasn't taking any chances. This wasn't just about the fence anymore, it was about defending my rights. When the day of the meeting arrived, I was ready. I drove over to the HOA office, preparing myself for a showdown. As I walked into the room, I could see that the board members were already seated, some looking at me like I was the villain in a neighborhood drama. Karen was sitting at the head of the table, her arms crossed and a smug look on her face. She clearly thought she had the upper hand, but I wasn't going to let that intimidate me. The meeting started, and the HOA president introduced the issue. He briefly explained how my fence had blocked access to the public road, and how several neighbors had expressed concerns about the inconvenience it was causing. Karen quickly chimed in, making sure to mention that this shortcut was essential for everyone. "This road has been used by all of us for years," she said. "And now, we're stuck using the main road, which adds several extra minutes to our commute. This is causing unnecessary trouble." I let her speak, but I wasn't buying any of it. It was all about convenience for them, and not about respecting my property rights. I raised my hand, and the president nodded for me to speak. I stood up, feeling the weight of the situation. "I understand your concerns," I said calmly, "but the truth is, this isn't a public road. This strip of land is private property, and I have every right to restrict access to it. It's not a shortcut, it's my land, and I don't want anyone driving through it without my permission." There was a moment of silence in the room. I could see Karen's face redden with anger, but I also noticed a few of the board members exchanging glances. They seemed to be reconsidering their stance. One of them spoke up, asking, "Are we sure this is even within our jurisdiction?" Another board member added, "I don't think we can force him to do anything if it's his property." It felt like the tide was starting to turn. But Karen wasn't ready to give up. She slammed her hands on the table, causing a few people to jump. "This is absurd," she shouted. "Just because you have a piece of paper saying you own the land doesn't mean you can mess with everyone's lives. We've been using that shortcut for years. You're causing unnecessary trouble for the whole community." At that point, the other board members began to murmur among themselves. One of them asked, "Are we sure we can force him to remove the fence?" Another added, "Maybe we should focus on resolving this without escalating things further." I could see that they were starting to realize they had no legal grounds to force me to remove the gate. Their position was weaker than they thought. I stayed calm, knowing I had the law on my side. As Karen continued to shout, the board members seemed to grow more uncomfortable with the situation. I could tell they were starting to second-guess their stance. The pressure was clearly mounting, and Karen was losing her grip on the room. Finally, the president raised his hand to calm everyone down. "I think we've discussed this enough for now," he said. "We'll need to review the legalities and talk to our attorney before making any further decisions. But for now, it seems like we don't have much choice but to respect the property owner's rights." It felt like a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. I had stood my ground, and now it seemed like the board was starting to back down. Karen, however, wasn't finished. She was visibly upset, her face flushed with anger as she stormed out of the meeting. "This isn't over," she hissed, shooting daggers at me with her eyes. "You'll regret this. I'll make sure the HOA does something about it." I didn't let her words faze me. I had made my case, and the board members were starting to realize that they couldn't force me to do anything I didn't want to do. A few weeks passed, and things seemed to calm down. The HOA had told Karen they would review the legalities, but I could tell they weren't eager to push the issue further. Then, out of nowhere, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it was more aggressive. They insisted that I needed to restore public access and remove the gate or face legal action. They were clearly trying to pressure me, but I knew they were bluffing. I wasn't going to back down, especially after everything that had happened. I knew my rights, and the law was on my side. I continued to monitor the property, checking my cameras and making sure no one tried to trespass again. To my surprise, some of my neighbors, who had been using my land as a shortcut, came to apologize. They admitted they had been wrong to drive across my property and promised they would never do it again. A few of them even expressed support for my decision to block off the land. It felt good to know that not everyone was against me. But then, things took another unexpected turn. One afternoon, while I was out running errands, I got a call from my lawyer. Apparently, Karen had reached out to her own lawyer and was planning to take me to court. She claimed that the HOA had authorized the road as a public access point and that I was violating some sort of community easement by blocking it. My lawyer quickly assured me that there was no easement in place, and the HOA had no legal standing in the matter. It was clear that Karen was just trying to intimidate me, but I wasn't going to let her win. Rather than waste time and money in court, I decided to take a different approach. I reached out to a local news station that specialized in property rights and HOA issues. I explained my situation and sent them photos of the land, the fence, and the letters from the HOA. To my surprise, they responded quickly and asked to interview me. A few days later, I found myself in front of a camera, explaining how the HOA was overstepping its bounds and how I was simply protecting my private property. The news team was incredibly supportive, and I made sure to highlight how I had followed all the legal channels to make sure everything was legitimate. The interview aired